Well, since we don't have anyone attending, I'm going to do a quick run through of the slides just for a recording because this is an important topic and I'm hoping that some people may watch the video later. One of the major issues we face in higher ed right now is closing some of those equity gaps. As our student body has become more diverse, we're seeing many more students entering college who are not as well prepared as our best students were in the past, and we're seeing some very differential outcomes. And the students who are most at risk are the students who are going to be most severely burdened by the burden of debt that they'll be leaving with. So it is really important that we address this issue. So I would encourage you to either type in that URL or scan the QR code with your camera, and it will allow you to make a copy of these slides because there's a lot of resources that will be shared, both in the slides and some supporting resources. And you can always pause the video here because I'm going to hop right on to the next screen. And when we talk about equity gaps, we should know that there are many different equity gaps out there. Certainly, we see them by race and ethnicity, and those are some of the most severe. We see some by gender, particularly in the STEM fields. We see equity gaps tied to income, which in the data is typically measured by students who are Pell eligible. We see equity gaps tied to first gen versus continuing generation status. And here's just an illustration from 2024, which a couple months ago at least was the most recent data that was available. And what we see is that on average, private nonprofits do the best. Public 4 years do a little less well, and public 2 years do quite a bit less well in terms of graduation rates. But that's not surprising because many people attend two-year institutions to pick up some job skills, sometimes for certificates and so forth. And many students attend in the hopes of transferring to a four-year college. And as long as their credits are transferring, they don't necessarily have to stay for the whole 4 year, the whole 2 years to get to graduate from an associate's college, from a two-year college. So, but we see in terms of race that white students, Asian students have the best outcomes within private four-year institutions, 85.4% end up graduating. And this is within 6 years of graduation. A much smaller proportion has always graduated in 4 or 5 years than 6 years. In fact, 6 years has been the average time to graduation has been about 5 years for about 40 or 50 years now, so this is nothing new. We see that white individuals do a little bit less well than Asian, but the differences are fairly small. Hispanics do significantly less well, and the worst outcomes occur for Black individuals. And much of this is also tied to, again, higher rates of poverty and higher rates of first-gen status. So there's multiple factors at work there. So one of the things we can do to try to address this is building a sense of community. And when students feel that they're part of a community in the institution and in classes, when they feel they belong there, it reduces equity gaps. And there's been a growing body of research suggesting this. And there are some things we can do to help improve this. One of the simplest things is to learn and use student names. And there's a lot of good strategies for that. I'll share some resources in a minute, but Michelle Miller, for example, has a short book on this through the new University of Oklahoma, relatively new University of Oklahoma press series, which picked up where the West Virginia University series had left off when that got shut down. And we also did a podcast with her, with Michelle Miller. So I encourage you to either listen to the podcast or buy the book. She has some really good and effective strategies, but it is difficult to learn names. Don't show up right at the start of the class, or even worse, after the class is supposed to begin, and stay late. So chat with students a little bit at the beginning of class, and also stay after. Don't rush out to the door. Stay and chat with students, and again, help them feel a little bit more comfortable and that you're interested in them. such things. When you're teaching, you don't have to stay at the podium. We very rarely chain people to their desks up there. Wander around. Teaching by wandering or teaching by walking around is a really effective strategy, especially if you're teaching larger classes. There are always those students who hang out way in the back of the room, and getting to know them a little bit can help them feel a little bit more connected, because they're often back there because they don't feel that they're as much a part of the class or the institution. And just by going back there when they're working on activities and helping them and chatting with them, asking how they're doing and assisting them when needed, can make them feel much more connected and can help build that sense of belonging. Another thing you can do, and we've talked about this in some earlier workshops this week, is discover student interests and try to use examples that connects to the interests of the students in the room. And one of the ways we talked about that, and that shows up on a couple of sessions that took place earlier using AI to build an inclusive environment, is by doing a classroom environment, is to give a survey to students, collect information on what their interests, their hobbies, their career goals are, and so forth. And then you can even use AI to help create some examples and scenarios and problems and other materials that connect to the students you actually have in your class, rather than a generic student that you might imagine you have. And remind students regularly that you're available to help them. Put that in the syllabus, but also convey that information regularly. And again, sending emails to students when they're struggling, contacting them, reaching out to them, and reminding them that you're there to help them can help keep things working smoothly. And again, there's quite a bit of research that is summarized in some of the documents that will be shared at the end of the session. So building community and building a sense of, well, actually the two studies I was thinking of are right on the slide. One was connected by Elizabeth Canning. I forgot her first name, White and Davis. White is a graduate student working with Elizabeth Canning, and Davis is an instructor in, I believe, a chemistry class. Chemistry class, where two messages were sent out after the first two graded assignments with growth mindset messaging. And what was found is that the students who received that messaging ended up having higher grades than students who did not. It was a randomized controlled experiment. And the students who got those personalized or those messages, just reminding them that it's not uncommon to struggle, and that with some effort, with some effort and support and some practice, they'll be able to be successful. What they found is that on average, the students who received that growth mindset messaging had higher grades at the end of the term, but the increase was largest for first gen students. And then in another study, by Michael Kurlander and S.E. Carroll. I forgot their first names there, but this was in a large economics class. The title of the study was My Professor Cares. A very similar type of message went out, where it was personalized messages that, instead of having growth mindset messaging, just reminding the students that you care about their success and that you were available to help them when they're struggling. And in both cases, by the way, experiments with doing just one message did not have very much of an impact, but the repetition of that did lead to a larger increase in student performance. And in this case, they found that it was particularly effective for Black males, where the equity gaps are often largest. And they followed this up actually over 4 years, and they found there was higher graduation rates, not just higher grades at the end, but also higher rates of persistence, not just 1 year ahead, but persistence to 4 years after the fact. So one way of building community is between students and faculty. Another way, though, is to help build connections and community within the class, using cooperative and team-based learning activities, where you sort students either randomly or using a neutral criteria, can be really effective in helping students feel connected to the class and getting to know each other. And in general, the reason for using random or neutral criteria is that if students are left to themselves, they'll tend to choose other students that they know. And if you're teaching upper level classes in particular, the students that they know are likely to be students who they've taken many more classes with, who tend to be relatively strong students or are connected through a sports team or some other way outside of class. And the ones who do not have friends in the class are typically the students who are, again, most at risk. So by randomly creating groups or by using a criteria such as the number of previous courses in the discipline or something similar, you're going to be able to create more balanced groups. And also the focus of the work, the focus of the group meetings is more likely to stay on the actual assignments at hand. If they were formed because they all knew each other, because they were in the same fraternity or sorority, or because they were in the same sports teams, or they just took many classes together, they may be focusing more on things and discussions outside of the class. But because the purpose of the group was just for the purpose of the class, it's a nice way to get students to know each other within the class environment, where the focus can be more on the academic pursuits, but where they're also getting to know each other better. Using a UDL approach and providing students with multiple ways of expressing their knowledge can be helpful, especially if they shared that with each other, so that students can see what other students are doing, can help build community. And this is one of the UDL, one of the main principles of the UDL framework. And hi, Sam. I had already started a little bit before. You haven't missed too much yet, and I'm recording it. So giving students multiple means of action and expression, and in general, building UDL into teaching can be really effective. A good way of helping students get to know each other is using peer instruction activities. One way of doing that in larger classes is by doing polling, where you ask a question, you have students vote individually after they thought about the response, and then before you reveal the correct answer, assuming there is a correct answer, you have them talk to each other, and then they argue with each other. I generally, in my large class, when I do this, will ask students to try to find someone whose answer was different than theirs, and to make a case for their response and listen to the other person's response, and then decide which is better, who had a better case and a better argument. And that will almost always result in more correct answers in those cases or those questions where there are correct answers. There's a lot of other things you can do with peer instruction, even things as basic as think, pair, share, and doing more group activities in general can be helpful. Encourage students to get to know each other. One of the things I do at the very start of my large classes, this could be through icebreakers, but one really simple thing I do on the very first day of the large class is I ask students to I have usually 250 to 400 students in that class, and I encourage them to talk to the people around them, to introduce themselves, to tell them what their major is, what their hobbies are, what their career goals are. And it leads to it helps build those connections. And what I always say is, in these classes, you're probably going to be sitting in the same seat every day for the rest of every class day for the rest of the semester. And you're going to be working with the people around you. So why not get to know them? And the volume gets pretty loud for a bit, but again, it does help to build community. And some of those students will end up working together, studying together throughout the rest of their career and as we go. When you have discussions, if you're, larger classes, it's hard to get everyone involved, but use inclusive discussion strategies, which might include giving students other ways of participating. It could be through polling software. It could be by writing something up and sending something through the LMS. It could involve just, instead of having the same students volunteering, randomly calling on students, which sometimes works well, sometimes doesn't. But it could also involve, again, think, pair, share, where you randomly call on one person, but ask them to present the answer given by the other person or what they came to as a conclusion. Because if people are uncomfortable stating their opinions about a topic individually, they tend to be much more comfortable if they're sharing something that they that is the joint response of more than one person, because then it's not something as personal and they don't feel as much at risk typically. There's a lot of things you can do. Sometimes just waiting until you have at least 3 responses before you call on someone, etc., can be useful, because some students really are not comfortable, particularly in larger classes, of volunteering. Again, one of the most inclusive discussion strategies is small groups, which again could be as small as 2 with a think, pair, share type activity. And also, if you're using small groups and cooperative groups and so forth, rotate within the group who is reporting out for whatever the activity, who is recording things within the group, assigning some role. Again, if you're going to have persistent groups, do it in a way where the roles, rotate among the participants. And try to make sure that you have relatively balanced participation. Okay. Now, in terms of structuring your course, make sure that in terms of multiple means of representation, another UDL principle, make sure that you have examples that are inclusive of diverse voices, particularly diverse voices of people that may be present in your classes. Don't just stick with the official canon of the discipline. Bring in more voices and try to get more students to participate, bringing in their own reactions. Because sometimes you'll find that, some groups are not well represented in the traditional academic canon, and asking students for their own reactions and so forth, and their own reflections can be a way of bringing in more diversity and treating diversity as a strength within the class. Because again, there are so many studies that find that diverse groups tend to come to better conclusions than less diverse groups in general. Avoid practices that generate stereotype threat. Sometimes instructors have done things like saying, well, you're Black or you're Hispanic. What do you think about this issue? Don't try to have one person serve as a representative of a group. They may choose to provide a response that may work that way, but try to avoid, terminology or other things that may generate stereotype threat, where people may feel that they're less likely to belong because of their group characteristics or some characteristics of one of the groups that they're part of. One of the worst things, and this was popular about 15 years ago, was an equity walk. Where people would start off a class by asking everyone who was a first, or let's say a continuing generation student, to take a step forward. Everyone whose parent had a college degree. Well, that was already there, sorry. Everyone who had 2 parents living at home to take a step forward. Everyone who, basically, people who had more privilege would walk forward, people who had less would walk backwards. And the goal of that, as people were doing it, was to show just how unequal our world is. And while conveying that we recognize that there's inequality is good, we don't want to emphasize to students that they come from a background that may be harmful for them. We want to make sure that everyone believes, and we should believe ourselves, that everyone is capable of being successful. Try to decolonize your curriculum. Try to find voices that are diverse, representing many viewpoints. That makes a class more interesting. And again, it helps students develop critical thinking skills rather than just trying to memorize this defined canon. And a good place to start, if you're not familiar with other literature, is to do a search for decolonize, a web search for decolonize, and then whatever your discipline is. And there's a very good chance that you'll find some websites out there that will have some materials with it, some other sources of readings, etc. And again, as I mentioned before, if you want to have students reflect on some of these inequities in our society, just having students share their own examples from their lived experience can help can bring in more diversity into the discussions. but don't tie their experiences to their particular demographic, racial, or gender characteristics. Um, Now, one of the most powerful interventions that we've seen is having a growth mindset. Carol Dweck wrote about this, and there's been a lot of research that's gone on since she wrote her book on growth mindset. And basically, a growth mindset is a belief that everyone can be successful by practice. That the alternative to a growth mindset is one where you believe that you're either good at something or you're not doing it good at something. And we pretty much all have a growth mindset in some things and a fixed mindset in others. I know one of the things we often see, for example, in student discussions is in economics or in STEM fields, for example, people will say, I'm not a math person. I really don't get math. Sometimes in creative fields, people will say, I'm not very creative, I'm not very artistic, etc. And that's kind of a fixed mindset, and we want to try to break them of that habit. It's something I come across all the time in introductory economics. And, I'll say, well, you may not consider yourself a math student, you're a math person yet, but the semester isn't over. By the end of the term, you'll be much more comfortable with math and you'll be able to use it fluently in the applications that we're doing in class. And just try to break down that belief that either they're good at something or they're bad at something. Because if they believe that they are bad at something, they are not likely to put a lot of effort into improving. If they believe they're good at something, they're also often not very likely to put a lot of effort in improving. But if we can get them to remind them of cases where, things were difficult at first, like learning how to ride a bicycle or something similar, but as they worked at it, they got progressively better at it, and remind them that academics is very much the same sort of thing. Normalize learning from mistakes. One term that's been used for that is failing forward, using mistakes as a growth opportunity. One thing that people can also do is talk about relevant self-disclosure about areas where we may have struggled with courses or with learning things, preferably ones that end up with a good positive ending. But reminding students that we all struggle as we learn things can be helpful. Using low stakes and no stakes assessment with opportunities for revision and so forth can be really helpful. Opportunity for revision. Angela Bauer she was at Green Bay and High Point. She's moved on to another institution now, but she had done some growth mindset interventions at both institutions. And when she was at Green Bay, she had done that where she gave some extra support to students who were struggling, and that was very effective. But at High Point, I think it was in a biology department, although I'm not positive. It was either bio or chemistry. She was the chair of the department, and she shared one slide each week with all the people teaching the introductory classes, which had some type of a growth mindset example. And in doing that, the really fascinating thing is that just that one slide a week, with a brief discussion of it in each class, ended up essentially eliminating all the racial gaps in academic performance in terms of the class grade and persistence. It was an amazing effect on that. Canning, White, and Davis, I mentioned before, had found that growth mindset messaging significantly increased students' grades and retention, and so forth. Another study that Elizabeth Canning did focused on faculty mindset. And what she did, along with a few co-authors, was she looked at STEM instructors at a large R1 institution, and they administered surveys or mindset surveys to faculty. And what they found was that students, and they also did the same thing to students in those classes, and what that study found was that the faculty who had growth mindsets had students who ended up with higher grades, but also smaller equity gaps. The faculty who had fixed mindsets, who believed that students either were able or were not able, ended up with lower grades for all students on average, but also a larger gap between the students who, again, traditionally had done better and the students who traditionally had done less well. And and the interesting thing is that the impact of faculty mindset was at least as large or larger for many than the impact of the student mindset. So it is important that we believe that our students can be successful. If we don't believe that our students can learn and become better at what they're doing because of what we're doing with our classes and things, maybe this is not the best career to be in. But faculty mindset does vary substantially. That was probably an overly strong message or thing to say, but it is important to believe in your students because that message does get picked up by students and that does affect their success. Um, Using evidence-based teaching strategies can be really effective. And there's really only a few things that have been shown consistently to be effective. And retrieval practice is probably the most important. And that was earlier called the testing effect. Studies of this goes back to the 1880s or 1890s, where it was initially just called the testing effect. And the studies have been done literally thousands of times now, and what they all show is that the more time students spend retrieving information that they've already acquired, the more likely it is that they'll remember that longer. So the more we practice retrieving information, the more we recall. We're able to recall things later, the stronger the neural connections are, and the more likely it is that we can remember these things. And also, it increases transfer ability. The transfer ability is the ability to take things you learn in one context and apply them in other contexts. So practicing retrieving information is helpful. And this is not what students tend to do, which is why it's kind of important to build this into our courses. Students, and we probably did the same thing when we were students, tend to focus when studying on repeatedly rereading something. And what many, many studies have shown is that repeated attempts to store information have no long-term effect on our ability to recall information. It does work in the short run, maybe within 3 to 12 hours or so, which is when much of the studying often takes place before large exams. However, a week or so later, pretty much everything that you tried cramming tends to be forgotten. But when you engage in retrieval practice, you're practicing trying to reconnect to that information that you stored. And what's important is your ability to retrieve information. Trying to store things repeatedly isn't very helpful if we are not developing those synaptic connections that allow us to retrieve information. Another thing that's been shown to be extremely important is spreading out the practice sessions. That if you spend a lot of time doing something, you tend to do really well in the short term, but if you spread out your practice, that also increases your long-term recall. And again, there have been lots of studies of that. Interleave practice is also important. And interleave practice is when you mix up the types of things you're practicing or you're trying to retrieve information from. One of the classic studies that was done at the University of Washington was to have students watch videos describing, I think they were 10-minute videos, describing how to measure the volume of three-dimensional objects. So they had a cube, they had a sphere, they had, I think it was a prism, and they had a cone or something similar. And in one case, they watched the video and then they had 10 questions on it. They watched the next video, they had 10 questions, and so forth. That was the block practice. In the other case, they watched all 4 of the videos together, and then they randomly had a mix of the very same 40 questions. And what happened is when they were tested on it, they did really well when they practiced something and were tested immediately, practiced something else and were tested on it immediately. But when they were retested a week later, they remembered virtually nothing, that their ability to recall those things had dropped to basically random guessing because this was, I think, a multiple choice measure. And then in the other case where the students had the interleave practice, where they had to remember not only how to plug the numbers into a formula, but they had to think about which formula to use, they ended up actually scoring better a week later than they had on the test initially because they didn't do that well because interleave practice is harder because you have to remember more. There's more cognitive processing. And basically, what the research tends to show is that the more effort we place on learning something, the more likely it is that we will recall it. And that's why interleave practice tends to be helpful. And Bjork and Bjork refer to that as desirable difficulties. And it's similar to what Vygotsky talked about when he was discussing the zone of proximal development. That basically, if something is too easy, you get bored. If something is too hard, people give up. But you want to have an appropriate level of challenge because that does tend to, again, provoke more mental effort, more cognitive effort. And that's one of the main concerns that people have about AI, that people are often, or students are sometimes taking the easy way out and offloading that cognitive processing, which limits the ability to recall and, develop your skills. Another thing that more effort in recent years has been shown is using metacognitive reflection, reflecting on learning as you're doing it, and reflecting on the process of learning tends to deepen your ability to learn when you actually spend some time, or having students spend time reflecting on what they've learned and how much they've learned and so forth. It tends to be helpful. There's some ways of building this in: adaptive learning, personalized learning, mastery learning systems, kind of build in all of these to some extent, especially some of the AI adaptive learning platforms where you can create custom learning paths, building in retrieval practice, space practice, interleave practice. The metacognitive reflection is something we typically have to add, although there are some quizzing systems that include that. For example, even with iClicker, which we have here on campus, you can have students rate their confidence in their answers, and then you could have them reflect on, whether they in fact knew it better than they thought they did, or whether in fact perhaps they didn't understand things as well. And in either case, that's helpful in helping them better understand what they know and what they don't know. Um, Another major issue that can affect student success is resource scarcity. If you're hungry, you're not going to learn as much. If you're worried about whether you will have a place to live in another month or two, you're not going to be able to learn as much. The more mental effort is placed on worrying about these things, the more difficult it is to concentrate on academics. And we've done quite a bit on campus over the last few years to address that by providing more support services, but it's an area that's not going to be getting less severe. And especially delays in purchasing text can be really important, which is one of the reasons why many of us have been advocating using OER text or even inclusive access, where all students have first day access. OER, open pedagogy, can be helpful. If not, that inclusive access, or whatever it's being called now, giving students the same access to all students when they start the class, rather than having the students who are most at risk not being able to access the textbooks until it's too late and it's hard to catch up. And sharing information with students on campus resources supporting mental health, food insecurity, and so forth can be really helpful. There's a lot in this slideshow. Another thing that's been shown to be important, Vijayasathi and Kelly Hogan have emphasized this in their work on inclusive teaching, is the role of structure. And the structure could involve something like scaffolding assignments. Students come into our class with very different degrees of preparation. If you went to a high school that in which most students went on to college, or if you went to a private high school or something similar, you probably got lots of preparation in how to write essays, how to complete college types of assignments, how to do annotated bibliographies, and so forth. If you went to a school where 3 to 4% of the high school class goes on to college, you probably didn't get very much or any of that support through the schools. Providing more scaffolding, breaking things up into smaller components to help guide students so that a mistake early in the process isn't going to be fatal later on. So that, if you're doing a large paper project, ask students to submit a proposal for a topic first, give them some feedback, ask them maybe to come up with a bibliography, give them some feedback on, whether the sources are appropriate, whether they, talking about, peer-reviewed articles, research, and so forth. But giving them feedback all the way results in fewer students going off in less productive directions, and being more transparent about your expectations can be helpful. Feedback throughout, and providing clear and complete instructions, because we often assume certain things about what we're asking in our assignments that may not be as clear to students who have not been exposed to that type of assignment in the past. And that's another good use of AI, having it evaluate your assignments for possible areas of misunderstanding. And it's certainly much better to read assignments that meet what you were hoping they met, rather than seeing as students had misinterpreted the whole thing and are doing something that doesn't really align with the expectations. And, some of that may be because we didn't really make those expectations as clear as we could have. Another good thing is to provide examples of high quality work, and maybe some examples of less acceptable work, which, we probably don't want to have students ask students, could we use your paper as an example of really crappy work? But we could create our own variants of poor quality work, or we could have AI generate lower quality work, and so forth, and let students show what represents high quality work and what doesn't. Ken Bain had an example where he has students go through in small groups, and he gave them an A paper and a C paper. And he asked them in the groups to determine what made one paper an A paper and the other a C paper. And they came up with their own lists, and then they used that to develop a rubric that was then used to evaluate work. And he said they all ended up with better papers that way, because it's easy to evaluate the shortcomings in someone else's work rather than your own, especially if you're not sure about what represents high quality work in a particular class. And the tilt approach is helpful. We've talked about that in other sessions. It's something we're going to be, I think, focusing on a lot more in the next year or so. Basically, that's just making all of your guidelines very clear and transparent to students, perhaps including rubrics, and also explaining the purpose of every assignment to help them seem more meaningful for students who may not understand why we're asking them to do certain things. Active learning, we've got other workshops on it. I don't want to dwell on this in much time. I'm talking way too much. But active learning tends to increase learning for all students. But they're largest for first-gen students, Pell-eligible students, and from students from historically minoritized groups. So we've got other sessions and lots of resources on active learning. Sometimes students resist. They much prefer sitting in the classroom, listening to a lecture, and having it all seem to make sense. The only problem is they don't do quite as well when they're faced with having to do these things on their own. With active learning, one of the reasons why it is often resisted by students is it makes it clear immediately sometimes that students don't understand something as well as they thought they did. And that doesn't feel as good as sitting in the class and nodding and smiling and have it all seem reasonable. And again, there was a big study, I think it was at Harvard or maybe MIT, where students were broken up were classified into whether the classes were active or passive learning or lecture-based. And what they found is that students in lecture-based classes felt that they had learned more. Students in active learning classes felt that they had learned less, but when they had different sections of the same courses, the students in the active learning classes significantly outperform the students in the classes that were lecture-based. So students learn more, but they don't always feel that way. And they'll often say in the evaluations things like, you're supposed to be teaching me. You're making me learn all this stuff on my own. And that is a barrier we have to overcome when we use active learning, because, we can remind students that we can't really learn it for them, and that learning does take effort, and practice is how they get better at it. But again, it is something that can be challenging. Um, Autonomy supportive instruction is giving students more autonomy, co-creation of the syllabus, of course AI and discussion policies, giving them, as mentioned before, multiple means of action and expression, can all increase student motivation, intrinsic motivation. And when people feel that they have a say in something, they're likely to put more effort into it. And that's been shown in so many studies. And that also tends to reduce equity gaps. And now there's a link to some resources here. And you can either scan in that QR code or type it in. I'll just drop it into chat here. And I'll show you I'll put in the link to the slides in just a second. But if we jump over here for just a minute, this is broken down into some of the research on equity gaps, some podcasts we did on this, building community, some strategies, some podcasts related to that, some on communication, and podcasts related to that, inclusive representation, and some resources, some of the studies on growth mindset, and some more general studies of evidence-based teaching strategies, and some podcasts we've done on that, some on scarcity, and some on structure, and some on active learning. And also autonomy supportive instruction, along with some podcasts on that. So that's all I have. So actually, let me just drop the original thing back in the chat. It was right on the first slide. Well, the first main slide, and it's right here. And this will give you a copy of the slides themselves with a link to the others, actually. So I'll pop that into the chat. Any questions or comments or thoughts? I've done a lot of talking after, especially now that I've said that, lecture is not that effective and we should be doing more active engagement. Okay, well, in any case, if you have any questions, stop by or send an email and I'm happy to help out. Or at least, make some suggestions. Okay, I will stop the recording. I will try to stop the recording. It's buried under some controls.